Today we're going to be ranking the past 10 pay-per-views in the UFC from UFC 280 versus 290. I literally just filmed this and I checked the recording and my mic wasn't on the entire time, so I've literally just had to redo the entire video. So I have already filmed this, but we're just going to go straight in there. We're going to do it in a random order as well. In fact, no, we'll go UFC 280 first. UFC 280 for me, I'm going to put it in. I'm going to put it in B tier. I'll put it in B tier. The main event was interesting. We had Islam Makhachev versus Charles Oliveira for the lightweight belt. Islam won in Abu Dhabi. A lot of Oliveira fans were upset. Oliveira just got beaten by Islam. The co-main event was quite annoying because on paper this card was really stacked. This was like an S tier on paper, but then TJ Dillashaw ended up getting like injured in the fight, and then he made like hundreds of excuses after, proving that he's just an unlikable fighter. And then we had Pete Yan versus Sean O'Malley, which was a good fight, but then it was just a bit of a robbery, wasn't it? Pete Yan probably should have won that fight. Dariush versus Gamrot was an interesting fight. We had a Bilal Muhammad versus Sean Brady on the prelims. Bilal Muhammad get a TKO against Sean Brady, which was interesting. It was an alright pay-per-view. It could have been better. It could have played out a little bit better. You know, maybe if O'Malley was... I keep saying O'Malley. Maybe if Sterling would have faced somebody a little bit better than TJ Dillashaw, or TJ Dillashaw did just sign his name up when he was injured. And maybe if... I don't know if Yang got the decision over O'Malley, but overall wasn't a bad pay-per-view. I put it right in the middle. On paper it was like an S tier. It's at the top of B tier, put it that way, top of B tier. Then we move on, UFC 281. I'm going to put UFC 281. I'm going to put it at the top of A tier. Really, really good pay-per-view this was. Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira 1. This was a huge pay-per-view because they already had a rivalry in kickboxing. Obviously, Alex Pereira knocked him out twice. We had Weili Zhang. Everyone was excited for her to absolutely batter Carla Esparza. We had Dustin Poirier versus Michael Chandler, which was one of the funnest fights of the year. We had Frankie Edgar, unfortunately, on his retirement fight, getting knocked out by Chris Gutierrez. And then we had Dan Hooker finally get a win against Claudio Puelles, who deserved to lose that night. Prelims were alright as well. A lot of finishes on the prelims. Erin Blankfield finally shut Molly McCann up. This was a really good pay-per-view. Really solid pay-per-view. Great way to end the year. I know it wasn't the last one of the year, but it was a really good pay-per-view. Stacked. Performed really well. Top of A tier. This was an amazing pay-per-view. I loved it. It was a great pay-per-view. Adesanya getting beaten by Pereira. Zhang Weili absolutely just going through Carla Esparza like a hot knife through butter. Michael Chandler versus Poirier putting on an absolutely amazing win. Yeah, this is such a good card. Then we move on. UFC 282. I'm going to put this in C tier, man. I'm going to put it in C tier. Oh, I'm going to put it in C tier. It wasn't that great of a pay-per-view. It had Jan Blachowicz versus Magomed Ankalaev, which wasn't the funnest fight, and it ended up in a draw as well. Then we had Paddy Pimblett on the co-main event getting a robbery win over Jared Gordon. Santiago Ponzinibbio got a knockout. We had Darren Till versus Duplessis, where Duplessis unfortunately got rid of Darren Till and erased him from the UFC. Topuria versus Bryce Mitchell was a good fight. I'll give you that. Prelims had a good amount of finishes on it. You know, we had, I think this is the one that had Chris Curtis where he knocked out Buckley. It was a C tier pay-per-view. I know it was originally supposed to have Teixeira versus Yuri Prohaska on it, the rematch, but it was alright. It wasn't an absolutely terrible pay-per-view. It wasn't one of those that you'd feel ripped off if you paid for it, but it could have done way better. I mean, Paddy Pimblett on the co-main event, and he got a robbery on that fight as well. Yeah, I feel like the hype for pay-per-views kind of went out when this card came out. Wasn't great. For the last pay-per-view of the year, I expected them to do a little bit better than this. Yeah, I mean, especially after UFC 281, which was a really good pay-per-view, to go from that to this, it was kind of dead. It really was. Then we move on to... where is it? Here we go. Teixeira versus Jamal Hill for the UFC light heavyweight champion. I'll put this pay-per-view in C tier as well, but I'll put it above I put it above, what is it? Blachowicz and Ankalaev. I feel like UFC 283 was what UFC 282 should have been. It had a Glover Teixeira versus Jamal Hill, which was a fun fight for the light heavyweight title. We had an early finish with Davis and Figueiredo and Brandon Moreno for the flyweight title. We had Nick Gilbert Burns go out there and absolutely submit Neil Magny pretty quickly. We had Paul Craig get finished by Johnny Walker. It was good, but it could have been better. I know there was quite a lot of finishes on the prelims as well. I don't think it's on the level of UFC 280. I do think it's a lot better than UFC 282 though. We finally got we had the retirement of Glover Teixeira. Part of the reason why this is only in C tier as well is because you got to remember this was in Brazil, and the Brazil crowd were painful, man. Glover Teixeira is trying to announce his retirement, and the Brazilian guys are just screaming. Like, the Brazilians kind of ruined this card. But it wasn't a bad pay-per-view. It was better than UFC 282, but it wasn't that stacked. I feel like flyweight is a title fight. Everyone was bored of Figueiredo and Moreno at this time as well. This was the fourth fight, but yeah. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great. Let's put it that way. Then we move on to UFC 284. This was in February of 2023. Where is it? UFC 284. It was... I'll put it behind Makhachev versus Oliveira at B tier. The main event was really fun in Volkanovski versus Islam Makhachev. Really fun main event. People thought it was a robbery. I don't think it was. I think it was a good fight, really fun fight, mix of wrestling and striking. But I feel like Makhachev edged the decision just about by split decision. Yair Rodriguez got a quick finish over Josh Emmett to determine who fights for the featherweight belt next. Where Jack Della Maddalena get a finish pretty quickly. The prelims, it was kind of just filled with Australian fighters, if you know what I mean, because it was in Australia, so they're just going to stack it with Australian fighters. That's what it felt like. So if you're not Australian or you're not a fan of Australian fighters for whatever, I don't think this card will appeal to you too much. It was in the middle. Wasn't anything special to be considered, oh my god, look at that card stacked to the bone. But it wasn't a bad card. It performed well, had a decent amount of fighters on it, had a lot of prospects on it. Decent card. A lot of attention because of the main event as well. Title fight, champion versus champion. Yeah, UFC 284 was a solid pay-per-view. Good pay-per-view. Could have been better, but I'm not going to complain. UFC 285. Jones versus Cyril Gane. I don't know. I'll put it above Makhachev versus Volkanovski. Or do I? I don't know. Do I do it? I'll do it. UFC 285 had a lot of prospects on it. The main event had so much hype on it because it was Cyril Gane. I mean, John Jones returning to fight Cyril Gane in his first heavyweight fight obviously would have been 10 times bigger if it was Francis Ngannou rather than Cyril Gane, because Cyril Gane's not like a star at this point. But it was a big fight. Co-main event had a title fight, and it was an upset in the first round. 2 first-round submissions in a row. Then we had Jeff Neal versus Shavkat Rakhmonov. Shavkat and Jeff Neal, 2 upcoming stars, especially Shavkat. Shavkat got the submission win. Then we had Gamrot versus Turner, which was a nice fight. And then we had obviously another prospect in Bo Nickel get an early finish against Jamie Pickett. We had Cody Garbrandt get a quick win over, I think it was Trevin Jones on the prelims. We had a bit of a boring fight between Duplessis and Derek Brunson. It wasn't really filled with like current stars. It was the only current stars were Jones versus Gane, and the rest were kind of like up and coming prospects. So I can only put it so high. I don't think it was above UFC 280 just because UFC 280 had bigger names on it. But the main event for this was fantastic. Co-main event was a nice surprise. Rest of the card, just full of prospects. Better than Makhachev versus Volkanovski, I think. Good pay-per-view. It was one of the best ones we've had in the year so far. I mean, we'd only had 2 so far, but wasn't better than 281, wasn't better than 280, but the pay-per-views are starting to get momentum again, put it that way. Pay-per-views are starting to get momentum. Then we're going to go UFC 286. UFC 286 was Leon Edwards versus Usman 3. It was kind of like UFC 284 in the sense that there were just a lot of British fighters. So if you're not a British MMA fan or you're not a fan of the Brits, then it probably wouldn't have appealed to you because it was kind of stacked with the British fighters. Main event was fun. It was just Leon Edwards kicking the body of Usman and Usman trying to wrestle him, but he wasn't as effective with the second fight. Leon Edwards retained his belt. Usman fell into a coma in the second fight. So this was a nice little fight. Fiziev versus Gaethje, absolute war. That was a fun fight. That was kind of what made the card what it was. We had a quick finish by Gunnar Nelson against Brian Barberena. We had Marvin Vettori versus Roman Dolidze put on an absolute snooze fest. Prelims were just a couple of British fighters getting a win. Makayev was on there as well. A couple good knockouts on this card. It was alright. I'm going to put it behind Makhachev versus Volkanovski though, just because first of all, the main event for UFC 284 was bigger than this. I'd say this one had a better co-main event, but the rest of the UFC 284 had better fights on it. I mean, let's look at the main card of UFC 286. Who was it? It was Gunnar Nelson. Really for the featured fight, Gunnar Nelson. I mean, I know he's good, but him for the featured fight, I don't think he should have been on the featured fight. It was just kind of filled with Brits. That's what they do when they go to a certain place. They just fill it with their country's home fighters. Yeah. I'll put it at the back of B tier. It's just about better, good enough to be B tier. It's not C tier because it had a lot of hype in the main event and the co-main event, way more than UFC 282 or 283 did, but wasn't terrible. Then we move on. UFC 287. This was a really good pay-per-view. I'm going to put this above UFC 2. I'm going to put it above UFC 281. I think this was better. Now, the annoying thing about this pay-per-view is because I was so excited to watch it, but then I set my alarm and my alarm didn't go off, so I missed it, which was quite annoying. But for some reason, whenever Alex Pereira and Adesanya are fighting, the cards are amazing. We had Jorge Masvidal, a huge star, returning against Burns. That was an okay fight. It wasn't a war, but it was an alright fight. It was Masvidal's retirement fight. We had Adesanya absolutely knock out Pereira. We had Rob Font put Adrian Yanez to sleep. We had Kevin Holland put Santiago Ponzinibbio to sleep. We had Raul Rosas Jr. We had him losing an upset. We had an amazing fight between Chris Curtis and Kelvin Gastelum. It was stacked. It performed. It had everything you could ever want in a pay-per-view. It was in Miami as well. The vibes were amazing. The vlog series were fun. This was really, really good. So far, it was the best card we'd have had this year. At this time, better than UFC 281 in my opinion, just because I think it had more. I think it was just a better card overall, more stacked. You got Masvidal on the co-main, had a lot of wars on there. Very underappreciated this pay-per-view. One of the favourites, even though I didn't get to watch it live. Solid pay-per-view, A tier pay-per-view. Wasn't S tier. There is one in S tier, but it was a very good pay-per-view. So far, the best we've had this year. The whole Adesanya finally beat Pereira. Masvidal retired. Burns turned into a BMF. Solid pay-per-view. After that, though, we unfortunately took a little bit of a turn to the worst. After this, we got UFC 288. It was quite poor. Sterling versus Cejudo. It was an alright fight. Wasn't a war. It was an alright fight. On paper, it was really good. Bilal Muhammad beat Burns in a very boring fight. No surprise there. Andrade got finished. Kron Gracie made the main card really boring. It wasn't a great card. I'm gonna put it behind UFC 283, but above UFC 282. Because of the hype around the main event and the co-main event, I've got to put it above UFC 282. It wasn't stacked. It was kind of understacked. It wasn't like you wouldn't look at it and think it's an absolute shocker that they've decided to put this as a pay-per-view. But it wasn't exactly stacked. You don't look at this pay-per-view and say it's stacked. I mean, it was good for Aljamain Sterling. His legacy continues to grow. Bilal Muhammad confirmed next to the belt, which no one wanted. Not much finishes. A lot of boring fights on this pay-per-view. It's a C-tier pay-per-view at best, to be honest with you. It wasn't great, especially after UFC 287. We went into this. The press conferences were fun with Cejudo. Obviously, it was Cejudo's big return to UFC, which is what the hype was about. But yeah, it wasn't great. It wasn't great. It could have done a lot better. If there'd have been like another big featured fight on there, maybe it would have got better. But and remember, originally this was supposed to be Oliveira versus Dariush. We didn't even get that. Instead, that got moved to UFC 289. UFC 289 was one of the worst pay-per-views in UFC history. I've been a fan of MMA since early 2021. Call me a casual, I don't care. This is the worst pay-per-view that I think I've ever seen, ever, since I've been a fan. Amanda Nunes versus Aldana on the main event of a pay-per-view? Really? I mean, we've now got Shevchenko versus Grasso on the main event of a fight night, but on the main event of a pay-per-view, it was just Nunes battering Aldana till she got her decision and then retired, and the women's featherweight division was abolished. Dariush versus Oliveira kind of made the card what it was. Without that fight, wouldn't have really... That card should have never existed if this fight wasn't on it. Oliveira got a win against Dariush. Everyone was happy. We had a couple of a bunch of decisions on the main card, not even stacked. The prelims weren't stacked. Terrible card. Yeah, this is just a really, really, really bad card. I pray Dana, can we never get a card like this again? It was so bad. If you paid for this, you've been scammed. Yeah, if you paid for that card, you've been absolutely scammed. You deserve everything that came your way. Don't ever ask for any help again in life. If you paid for this pay-per-view, you've been... No one can convince me that this was a good pay-per-view. D-tier pay-per-view, and it probably will be forever. But in S-tier, the best pay-per-view, in my opinion, and we've had in the past 10, is the one that happened this weekend. UFC 290. International Fight Week. This was such a good pay-per-view. It had everything. It was stacked to the bone. We had Volkanovski versus Yair Rodriguez. It was a really fun fight, but Volkanovski mixed it up with wrestling and striking and battered Yair Rodriguez till he got a finish. We had an absolute war between Brandon Moreno and Alexandre Pantoja, which was a fun fight, and we got a new champion in flyweight. Robert Whittaker versus Dricus du Plessis was a nice little fight, and then Dricus du Plessis upset the world by knocking out Whittaker and creating a promo with Adesanya. We had another interesting fight, really fun fight with Dan Hooker and Jalen Turner. We had a Bo Nickel knock out Val Woodburn in 38 seconds, creating more star power for himself. We had Robbie Lawler beat Nico Price in the pitch-perfect retirement ever in 38 seconds, which is one of the best retirements I've ever seen. We get to see Robbie Lawler go out on a high. We had a couple of 20-second and 17-second knockouts. This card had everything. It had everything. It was stacked. It performed well. Good amount of wars and finishes. It was the best pay-per-view that we've had in the past, 10 pay-per-views. It was so good. It's better than every other pay-per-view on this list, in my opinion. Such a good pay-per-view as UFC 290. International Fight Week. Really... It was just really good pay-per-view, man. Really good pay-per-view. I enjoyed it so much. Couldn't have been better. Yeah, UFC 290, man. What a pay-per-view. What a pay-per-view. But yeah, if you agree with this list, please let me know. But personally, I think this is how it goes. Aldana versus Nunes shouldn't have been a pay-per-view. Rodriguez versus Volkanovski. Too good of a pay-per-view, but yeah. Let me know if you agree.